Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Civil Engineering School of Barcelona. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Eva Oller. I am Vice Dean of this school, and today I am here on behalf of Professor Esther Real, the Dean of the school, who couldn't join us today. As you may know, this seminar is part of a series of conferences that we are organizing because we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of our civil engineering school. And this is the fourth seminar, if I'm not wrong. The previous ones were, the topics were related to artificial intelligence, to oceanography, and also to mobility. I don't want to delay. As you may know, we are recording all these seminars and they will be available on our website in the near future. And I don't want to delay anymore, and I would without any further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Professor Frances Magriñá, who is going to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much for attending this seminar.
Good morning for everybody. I am going to make a little presentation that I would like to explain why Olivier Coutard is here. And for us, we have a very strong relation with the École des Ponts et Chaussées at Paris. This started with Roger Junyent. I don't have the photography here from her. I didn't found, but it's my fault. But for us, one of the, because it's necessary for you also, if you know the history of this school after 50 years, one of the persons, okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to repeat a little bit. I'm going to explain a little bit why Olivier Coutard is here. For us, we have a very strong contact for more than 40 years, with the École des Ponts et Chaussées in Paris. This is for two people. One is Roger Junyent. Roger Junyent has a contact with the direction of the school of École des Ponts et Chaussées and started the relation. She was a professor of sociology here in our department. Before it was the Department of Urban Planning. Urban Planning, the name it was Infraestructures del Transport y Territori. Now is a section of DECA, the Department of Civil Engineering and Environment. I don't know exactly what is the name in English now. But one of the persons that it has been very important for this school, it has been on the left, your left is Albert Serratosa. If there is a school in Barcelona, it's for him, because he has a very good relations at this moment with the minister, and it was possible to introduce the School of Civil Engineers. And he has a professor of urban planning for a long time. And also, you have the first generation. You have another person who has been very important is Manuel Erce. Manuel Erce is another all these. Well, there are two civil engineers, an architect, and other two civil engineers. And Manuel Erce is the second one. I think it has been now is not more professor, but he has been a reference after Serratosa. And we have also Salvador Tarragó, also with Roger Junyent. Salvador Tarragó, he's an architect now, but he also is not at the school at this moment. But he introduced also the history of civil engineering. And Roger Junyent introduced the aspect of social impacts of the civil engineering. And after there is Miriam Villares, Elizabeth Roca, who continue his proposals. And after we have also Pere Macias and Joan Miró, is another two professors, civil engineers. He has been working in a different, well, we have here now Pere Macias. He has been in different post for the administration. He continued to be professor. And also in a second generation, we have Miriam Villares, me, Elisabeth Roca, Josep Mercader, Albert Garola. Is our team of urban planning in our school. And for this, put the next one. Why Olivier Coutard is here? One of the references is Gabriel Dupuy on the left. He wrote L'urbanisme de réseau. It has been translated to Catalan, Spanish, and after English. And he was translated because Albert Saratosa wanted to introduce this book in Spain. And also for us is another reference is the review Flux. Flux is an international review made in France, and his director was Gabriel Dupuy, and after Jean-Marc Kovner, also in a co-direction is Olivier Coutard. He has been also direct. He's a very interesting review about infrastructures, networks, and how the city is built. And I think it's a very interesting information you can find there. And for us, it's a privilege to have today Olivier Coutard, because for us, and the next one, we have different books. Albert Saratosa promote an exhibit about Cerdà, because he has been in more than 100 cities around the world. It has been a reference. But also with Manuel Erce, he introduced a team and promote the publications of 4 books. One, it has been La ingeniería en la evolución de la urbanística, El soporte infraestructural de la ciudad, l'espai urbà de la mobilitat, construcció, ciutat i xarxes d'infraestructures. Itself promote also with the team, with Joan Miró and me also, and also different professors with l'espai urbà de la mobilitat who are teaching now in our department, as Daniel Rodriguez, different professors. And he wrote a very interesting book, if you can read, it's very interesting, it's El negocio del territorio, because you can understand that when you build infrastructures, you are making capitalist strategy, and you have to understand this. And for our team, we promote different books with different professors of our department about what is the interaction when you build an infrastructure. There are more books, more articles, but I would like to show some of them. That is our culture for us. Okay, and if we want to present Olivier Coutard. Olivier Coutard, c'est un ingénieur de ponts et chaussées, parce que vous savez qu'en France, Olivier Coutard is a civil engineer, but in France it's very difficult to enter into the school. It's not the same in Spain now, because now in France there is a concourse to enter the main schools of Minas, civil engineer, telecommunications. It's complicated to arrive there. He's a civil engineer of École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées, and he made a thesis in economic and social science. Also he's interested in socioeconomic of transport, and he's interested on the liberation of the supply electric sector. He knows the processes of liberalization of infrastructures. It has been in the last 3 decades. And he is also a researcher of CNRS. And I don't know if you know el CSIC. Do you know CSIC in Spain? The same thing is in France, is CNRS, is more interested in this. And his research is focused on the management and regulation of network services, water and energy supply, urban transport, telecommunications. He's interested in the reforms in these sectors and their social, spatial, and environmental implications. He was particularly interested in the relationships between the infrastructure, networks, and the dynamic of urban integration or fragmentation. He's interested also in mobility and automobile practice of people, household and low-income groups, and he's interested in the development and universalization of network service. You know, the model is the universalization of network service, but now it's not so evident. He is going to explain about this, and he's interested in the access to essential services for precarious and or insolvent households. Now he's more interested in urban energy policies and urban challenge of energy transitions. He's interested about the large technical systems and the development of alternative socio-technical configurations and the political problems. And he talked about the concept of post-network city, because in the new scenario it's not so evident this universal access to the network. And he's interested also with the links between infrastructure development, the intensity of metabolization process. We talk here about metabolization because he talked about the transformation of materials and energies for social purpose. And he's interested in the collective configurations of futures, because we are living a very strong transformation of society with the new knowledge society, and the networks is a reference, and also the networks of urban services. And for this, he is president of the section of Space, Territories and Societies of the CNRS. He has been from 2008 to 2012, also from 2016 and 2021. He has participated because he has been president of the Conference of Presidents of the different sections of research in France. And he has also he has been a technical manager of urban futures for the University of Paris Est. And he also he has been also the director of the LATS, is our departments. Écoles de Pont de Chaussée has a laboratory of techniques, territories, laboratoire, technique, territoire et société. This laboratory has been there for my thesis in France for 4 years, and it has been a very interesting experience because it's a multidisciplinary research center with around 50 permanent researchers and professor researchers who are interested in networks, institutions, and territories. He has been also, he promotes different researches at the French scale, and he has other things. He has been a member of editorial board of the journal Flux, Cahiers Scientifiques Internationaux Réseau et Territoire, who is co-editor with Marianne Olivier-Trigallot. It has been until 2020. And also, he has a member of the editorial boards of different journals, Journal of Urban Technology, Journal of Urban Sustainable Development, and he has been also a member of the scientific committees of different institutions in Europe and also in different places. For us, is a very important reference for us for what it means network and what is the link with the city. And also for me, another experience for him is another book who is very known. There is Urbanisme de Réseau, Network Urbanism. And also it exists another book, is Splinter in Urbanism. He is very known around the world. He talks about this liberalization of networks and the society. And he had a very interesting dialogue with Steve Graham and Simon Guy. I think it could be very interesting what is this approach. For me, I think we have now one of the persons who know better the relations between network and society. And now with climate change, with the energy crisis, and with other questions that we have around, I think he had make a different reflections that I hope that he is going to explain now, and it will be a very interesting reference for you. I hope it will be interesting. Okay, Olivier, contribute.
Thank you, Francesc. You have to help me with this because I'm not sure I can. Okay, simple enough. So, good morning, everybody. I have nothing to add to the presentation. I was trained as a civil engineer, and then I turned to social sciences and what we call, in our jargon, urban studies. But I've always remained interested in infrastructures, which are the core of the business of civil engineers, in a way. What is that for? Is that? Così? Non importa. No, don't worry.
Now it's good.
Okay. So, in the next 45 minutes approximately, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, Francesc will have to stop me. I will try to make sense of this very long title and to figure out why it's difficult to answer the question in the title. And I will proceed in 4 main steps. So I will first recast, so to speak, infrastructure issues in a broader picture, which has to do with modernity and urbanization over the past 2 centuries, let's say, which is the time scale in which modernity can be usefully discussed. I'll try and be as brief as possible, but the idea of this first point is to show that, of course, infrastructure systems or large technical systems or networks, and these words are not synonymous, but they are close enough. Of course, they involve a lot of engineering, in particular civil engineering, knowledge and know-how, but they involve much more. And that's what I would like to point as an introduction. Then I will show how powerful this idea of networked infrastructure has been and still is in our parts of the world and possibly in others, but I won't mention other parts of the world. What I mean by our part of the world is Europe, Western Europe, North America, what was previously called Western society. Now it's become the North. And I will not, at least not in my presentation, discuss infrastructure and urban issues in the global South, but you're very welcome to introduce that discussion after the presentation. And then thirdly, I will argue that we are in a moment where the course of infrastructures has to, in my view, has to change, and I'll explain why. And the question, and the last section would be, where to? Where should infrastructure systems head? And of course, it's a more tricky question, trying to anticipate future evolutions, but at least some of the issues facing today's infrastructures can help in that endeavor. Is it okay if I speak like that? Do I speak too fast or too slow or too slow? I can't do much better, I think, much quicker. So, but I can speak slower. Anyway, so first topic, modernity, infrastructures and urbanization. What do I mean by infrastructures? I start with, and it'll probably complexify during the presentation, but I'll start with what has been the dominant form of infrastructures in our part of the world over the past 100, 150 or even 200 years. Networked infrastructures, which I define as a set of interconnected equipments, centrally planned and managed, whether locally or nationally, and which provides more or less uniform service on a territory, some service area, so to speak, which by providing these homogeneous services, it helps unify. And of course, the examples of networked infrastructures are obvious, and I won't comment on each, but they all, one way or another, fit into that general and abstract definition. But the key point here is trying to explain why infrastructures have been so important in the development of modernity, of Western modernity, so to speak, in the past 2 centuries. And I think 4 arguments are worth keeping in mind. The first is that infrastructure systems have been very important in the advent of the modern state, the state as we know it today, national states, through what Michael Mann, a sociologist, has called already 40 years ago, it's infrastructural power. So if I had the presentation I wanted, I could read to you what Mann means by infrastructural power. If you give me 1 sec, maybe, because I think it's an interesting and valuable quote. The power of the state, so he defines infrastructural power as the power of the state to penetrate and centrally coordinate the activities of civil society through its own infrastructure. And he adds that the advanced capitalist state penetrates everyday life more than did any historical state. Its infrastructural power has increased enormously from Alaska to Florida, from the Shetlands to Cornwall. There is no hiding place from the infrastructural reach of the modern state. So the idea is that the state, in fact, uses infrastructure systems, transportation, telecommunication, as a means to extend its control, not necessarily authoritarian control, but its control, its monitoring, its surveillance of society. Second point, because if I start speaking, detailing too much, we never get through it. So second important point, the key role of infrastructure systems and the services they provide in, we can say, modern ways of life. And to a very large extent, modern ways of life rely on the continuous provision of a wide range of services that have to be universally available, affordable, limitless or unlimited in quantity, and available at all times. So 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, as they say in Walmart. And so it would take a long time to discuss this in any detail, but if you think about it, you'll see how much your own individual life depends on the continuous availability and functioning of these infrastructure systems. And conversely, because modern ways of life, or ways of life in general, do not change easily, they support also the continuation, the perpetuation of infrastructure services. Because once you get used to having access to continuous access to such services, then you are very reluctant to let go. Third point is what I have called the materialization by infrastructures of the temporal regimes or temporal registers typical of modernity. So I have a very complex figure to show, but the key idea is as I can show the picture. There it is. There are three different forms of temporality in society, at least as I try to conceptualize it. The spatial-temporal compression, which I have not mentioned, which is my fourth dimension in the previous slide, but I'll come back to it. The idea of horizon infrastructures, I've just mentioned it. And also what François Hartog has called the modernist or the modern regime of historicity. By regime of historicity, he means how societies relate to the past, the present, and the future, their past, present, and future, and how they relate their past, present, and future. And he argues that the modern period and modern era is characterized by a futurist regime of historicity, that is, where society is values collectively, there are, of course, all sorts of variations, but collectively values the future and makes decisions today based on what is expected in the future. So that's what he means. And this figure, but I won't comment it in too much detail, but tries to argue that infrastructure systems play a key role in materializing each of these temporal registers and how they reinforce each other. And the fourth element in this symbiosis between modernity and infrastructures is how infrastructures and the development of infrastructures has transformed space-time from pre-infrastructure times, that is, has compressed space-times and considerably facilitated connection, long-distance connections instantaneously or much more quickly than before. I don't have the figures clearly in my mind now, but if you compare the time it took to cross France from north to south at the time of the revolution, so at the late 18th century, and the time it took 50 years later with the train, which was relatively slow, it was divided maybe by 20, or so it would take 2 weeks at least to travel from the north to the south of France, and then with the train it would be possible in more or less in a day. Well, I'm not sure the figures are quite right, but so it's that kind of phenomena in all, and of course also of telecommunications infrastructures that have completely reconfigured space-time, and that have resulted in the fact that to the traditional, you have to be careful when you use these words, but anyway, to the traditional forms of spatiality that were based on proximity, on the fact that you were near to the other people with which you sought to interact. It has added to this spatiality based on contiguity a form of spatial temporality based on connections and long-distance, very efficient connections. Anyway, and all these are key dimensions of modernity, and all these have been strongly supported by the development of networked infrastructure. And in more normative and more political terms, the implication is that this symbiosis or symbiotic relation, so mutually beneficial relation, has sustained the belief in an ever more prosperous, just, and united networked society. What's his name again? I forgot the name of our colleague who coined this term, the networked society. Anyway, I should have added his book cover at the bottom of my slide. It would have helped. I would say one aspect of modernity which has a very strong currency today is the association, the notion of control and the association of infrastructure systems with control. And it's relatively easy and convincing to argue that infrastructure systems have been very powerful tools for modern societies to exert control on populations and space. I mentioned that earlier. On nature and material resources, and a lot of infrastructure systems have been involved in the transformation of material resources for social purposes. And also, and I'll come back to that at the end of the presentation, control of the future. That is the idea that with the development of large-scale infrastructures, modern society took a more firm hold of their collective futures. So this connection between infrastructures and control is important to keep in mind. But I haven't mentioned so far the last term of this first point, urbanization. And of course, there has been probably, it depends on how you define the urban or cities, but there has been several thousand years of story of urbanization before the modern infrastructures, network infrastructures I'm mentioning here, appeared at a significant level. But what is and this slide, I'm not sure I want to go through this, but yes, and so we can see I have to do that. The primary condition that allowed the emergence of cities, defined as relatively large, dense, and permanent settlements of heterogeneous individuals, which sounds abstract, but if you think of it carefully, you see it defines the urban in a basic way, but in a rather powerful way. So the emergence of cities or urban societies depends on a collective capacity to sustain the cities, and in particular to what we call agricultural surplus, that is the capacity of agricultural peasants, the capacity of peasants to produce more food than they and their cattle consumed. And it's not by chance that the earliest civilizations that we know of are civilizations that emerged in the most fertile parts of the world, in the Nile Valley and between the Tiger and the Euphrates, I don't know, in what was called Mesopotamia, because it's the places where agricultural surpluses were realized the most early in history. But then, of course, the development of cities requires organizations and requires relations between cities and areas of supply, because as François Hacher, who was a French urbanist, famously defined, and again, it would be better if I could read you the real quote, rather than trying to guess it. He defines cities as groups of population that do not produce their own means of food subsistence. So the idea that cities are dependent on the hinterland just to fulfill their basic needs, and in that definition, feeding urbanites. But urban life has also required coping with all sorts of problems created by urban density. The management of congestion, of pollution, of epidemics and health issues. But for centuries, it rested on, so to speak, natural infrastructures. Well, roads were not natural, but they were the first and for a long time the only form of technical infrastructure. So the Roman roads are a famous example of that. Roads, paths were very useful too, also man-made, so to speak, or human-made, and rivers. and this all changed from the early 19th century, or even a little earlier if you think of canals. And so infrastructure systems, large infrastructure systems, were very important in allowing the development of massive urban agglomerations. That is, both large and very populated, and because they helped manage the problems associated with the concentration of a large population in a small portion of space. So the rise of a networked city, I take this phrase from a famous book edited by, well, famous for us at least, edited by Joel Tarr, an American historian, and Gabriel Dupuy, which Francesca mentioned more than 40 years ago, and they were the first to conceptualize this idea, this connection between the development of infrastructures and urban development and urbanization. And the network city is a matter of circulation, communication, flow, permanent flow, speed. What Cerda, the famous Barcelona urbanist, called vialidad. I'm not sure my pronunciation is very good, but anyway, Barcelona, among experts, Barcelona is considered as one absolutely key example, key manifestation of the ideas of the networked city, because Cerda, in his plan for the extension of Barcelona, conceptualized this idea of generalized circulation and tried to articulate what we can call habitability and circulation. So I won't detail that too much because I have still a lot to address. But a key thing to keep in mind is that infrastructures, in a way, have not defined a specific form of urbanization. They have been compatible with extremely dense urban spaces, as can be seen in Paris, in Barcelona, in Hong Kong, or in many other parts of the world. But they have also supported what we call urban extension or urban sprawl, that is the diffusion of urban spaces on a very large spatial scale, by providing the same services, or more or less the same services, in those larger urban areas. So they supported both densification and extension, to the point that Françoise Choët, and this is the reason for my third image here, Françoise Choët, a famous, well, a French historian of cities anyway, and urbanism, defined and criticized in a way as what she called the reign of the urban and the death of the city. So she compared the urban and the general urbanization allowed by the development of infrastructures to the pre-existing city, so the Middle Age and early modern city, which was defined by a very small distance of transportation and very small hinterlands to supply for the city's needs. And of course, infrastructural development changed all that, and the hinterland of urban areas is considerably extended. So that was my first, the first part of my presentation. Is that reasonably clear? Or if you have questions, you can interrupt me at any time. But I turn to my second point, what I call the power of a network. It's a kind of a game with the title of another very influential book written in 1983 by a historian of technology, American historian of technology, Tom Hughes, called Networks of Power. And of course, it was a play on the words, because he was studying electrification, but he entitled his book Networks of Power to show that electrification is precisely the development of network providing power, electrical power in that case. But networks of power was to emphasize the very strong political dimension of infrastructural development. So he showed, and the whole book shows in a very convincing way how political interests, social interests are involved in the development of electrical networks and the way they were developed, and not only technical knowledge and technical know-how, even though he starts his book by saying that at the time electrical networks were the more complex human artificial constructs developed by the human mind. But in spite of that, his key argument was to say there was a lot more than technology and technological knowledge in the development of electrical networks. So I reverse the phrase and I speak of the power of the network. What does the power of the networks, that is, I mean by that the power of the idea of networked infrastructures. What does it rest on? Well, in my understanding, it rests on the combination of three elements. What we can call the modernist network imaginary, that is the idea that networked infrastructures will help fulfill the modern promise of ever improving living conditions, ever improving material prosperity, etc. So that's the modernist imaginary in which networked infrastructures play, in my view, a key role. A second element is what we can call network normality. That is what I mentioned previously, the idea that the general, universal, and continuous availability of a whole range of network services has allowed the development of ways of life that are very strongly characteristic of modern societies, again, at least in the western part of the world, or in the more wealthy parts of the world. And the third element, which is a modern network ideology, which relates to the idea that networks, in terms of the provision of collective services, essential services of daily life, networked infrastructures are a universal response and solution. It's the best configuration to provide to an entire population essential services that are essential for their daily life. And so it dominates any alternative socio-technical forms, so to speak. And it has had strong implications, because if you think that, for example, when the development of networked infrastructure generate problems, then you consider that these problems will be solved by a further step in the development of these infrastructure systems. It's a bit like competition for neoliberal thinking. If competition creates all sorts of, market competition, creates all sorts of problems, you can solve these problems easily by increasing competition, which in the end brings you in very dire situations, very problematic situations, but that's the power of ideology. And for networked infrastructure, you had a bit of the same. I take one example. In Paris, from the Paris region, the sanitation system, the sanitation infrastructure is centralized, so it's really an ideal, typical networked infrastructure. It's centralized at the scale of the Paris region. And I don't know what it is now, but 10 years ago, and I don't think it changed that much, when there was a major storm event in Paris, oh yeah, I forgot to mention that it's a unitary system. So you have a rainwater management mixed in the same pipes as sewage water. And so when there was a major storm event, the network would be saturated and then would overflow, and overflows would extend, would be observed to the other until the North Sea, so very far away from the where the Seine ends in the sea, because there were so massive quantities of effluents, and this problem was not only the consequence of the application of a network ideology, that is to say, we cannot think of anything else but extending the sanitation network, and even responses to these situations were, at least for a time, thinking of further expanding this network, which would have led or would lead to even bigger pollution events. So Francesc mentioned L'Urbanisme des Réseaux, published more than 30 years ago, and I chose this graph because I think it's very telling of, so it's a trend pattern for the extension of urban technical networks, and Dupuis' argument is that if you look through Western Europe and Northern America, you have that kind of general, it's called a logistic curve, maybe you know that, at least in French it's called a logistic curve, I don't know, I'm not so sure in English, but, and so he argues that it's a very general pattern of diffusion, so maybe this one was based on the example of France, but his argument was to say that in most Western countries you had the same profile of network extension, which proves how powerful the idea of the network was. And the last, because we also discussed with Francesc, and he said it was worth mentioning this splintering urbanism debate. So splintering urbanism is a book that was published in 2001, and which has been very influential in social sciences, not only in urban studies, not only in infrastructure studies, but throughout social science. And it probably contributed to the current situation in scientific debates, in social scientific debates, where the notion of infrastructure expands in many, many areas of social science. And so the splintering urbanism argument was that there were a set of processes within which infrastructure networks were being unbundled, deintegrated, so to speak, in ways that help sustain the fragmentation of the social and material fabric of cities. So the idea of Graham and Marvin was to say that networked infrastructures, on the form that I defined at the beginning, that is providing universal homogeneous service, were a powerful factor of urban integration, and because of, in particular, reforms of liberalization, but also in consequence, as a consequence of many other evolutions, this traditional regime of networks provision, that is homogeneous universal service, was unbundled, deintegrated, and services started to become more and more heterogeneous. And so they said this results in increased urban fragmentation. There is a lot to say about this debate. It was, at the start, it was based on observation on what was going on in the 1990s in Britain, where liberalization of utility companies and utility services, that was the term used in Britain, was very strong. And so they started with observation in the UK. And there were very strong things happening in the UK. For example, the water supply was privatized, people would be cut from water supply, and all sorts of diseases that had not been seen in the UK for several decades reappeared, such as cholera. Do you say cholera? Oh. Anyway, so there were very strong things happening in the UK. They just generalized the thing, and so seeing, and we had a long-lasting argument with them, because seeing from France, it seemed much less visible and much less present, this evolution towards splintering. And the other element, the other important argument, of course, if you say splintering urbanism, it's splintering means you're going from a less splintered to a more splintered situation. And in many parts of the world, and in particular in most cities in the global south, this was not the case. You didn't have an initial integrated urban situation and then splintering. You had at any time in history already very splintered urban spaces and urban societies. But that would take too long to discuss it. How long have I? Okay, yes. What started a new area of reflection in the debate we had is the fact of challenging their key assumption in the book, which was that fair and enduring universal access to essential services requires centralized infrastructure systems providing homogeneous service. That is a particular form of a network ideology that I mentioned previously. Whereas, because it's a bit complicated to read what is wrong with this assumption, whereas there were many parts of the world in which essential services were provided by much more heterogeneous, composite, hybrid systems, but in the end provided most people with essential services to carry on their daily life. So the idea started to grow to challenge, in the end, the idea of a network and saying, is it that true that the only or the superior, the best socio-technical form to provide essential services to urban populations and to populations more generally is a network, centralized network infrastructures? Are there not other alternative socio-technical configurations that can do the same job according to the local conditions? And of course, I do not have time to develop that, but developing large-scale centralized infrastructure systems requires all sorts of preconditions, in particular a strong state or strong public actors. And in order for those infrastructures to provide reasonably universal service, it requires that the urban population it serves is itself not too unequal. If a significant part of the population is very, very poor, then providing network services, even at a cost that would be considered low by the middle class in the rest of the city, it would simply not be affordable at all for that part of the population, and so the objective would be missed. Anyway, if this is clear so far, I turn to my third point, in which I would like to introduce the idea that the development of this infrastructure system is at a crossroads in a way, and I would like to do that by discussing the tension introduced by the development of infrastructure systems. It was not deliberately introduced, but it was introduced, in fact, a tension between local habitability, that is, the provision of services to a local populated area in order to allow the population to thrive, at least to survive, but ideally to thrive. So that's what I refer to by local habitability. But at the cost of global unsustainability, and this is what I would like to argue now. So far, you may have noticed that I have hardly mentioned the term environment, and it's true, it's a fact that in many infrastructure debate between, let's say, the 1980s and the early 2000s, the environmental issues and what we would call now material flow issues were by and large absent. this did not mean that there were no environmental issues. It just meant that they were ignored by social scientists interested in infrastructures. Engineers managing infrastructures, of course, would have to cope with the materiality of flows. Environmental historians as well had already coined the fact that the development of infrastructure systems had in history and into the present very severe, or very significant at least, environmental consequences. But in debates on infrastructures, up until the Splintering Urbanism book in 2001, which was really a turning point in those debates, environmental issues were absent. And in the book, in Splintering Urbanism, there is no mention of material flows, of environmental issues. There should, when you talk to the authors, there should have been a chapter, but this chapter was never written, and so things do not happen by accident. So it was just outside the frame. And the consequence is that all the narrative of the modern infrastructural ideal that was a core argument in splintering urbanism, the idea that in order to achieve urban integration, you need to have integrated infrastructure networks. The environmental dimension of this modern infrastructural ideal was also overlooked. And so, in a way, we can say that the framing of this debate entirely misses the other side of the coin, of the infrastructural coin. There's one side which is the development of service, social, spatial integration, the development of the welfare state, etc., etc. This is one side. But the other side is, what about the environment? And I would like, in the remaining time, which is not so long, maybe, what, 10 minutes? 10 minutes maximum, to suggest that this environmental dimension is to be seriously taken into account. Because in my understanding, infrastructural development was part and played a significant part in global environmental changes and what is called the Great Acceleration from the 1950s. You're familiar with the term Great Acceleration? Yet they usually have cap letters at the beginning of two words. The Great Acceleration is the idea that from the 1950s onwards, all indicators, all global indicators started to grow exponentially. I have slides, but I don't have time to detail it now, but I can show the slides after in the debate if you'd like. But it's striking the extent to which any indicator, any global indicator you take, it just literally explodes after 1950. And infrastructure systems also played a role, but it's very closely linked, of course, with the crossing of successive planetary boundaries. You know this terminology of planetary boundaries? You don't? You should. Well, you should. I mean, your professors should mention this, because I think for for engineers today, it's really a key dimension of the reflection. So maybe it was 15 or 20 years ago, a group of researchers at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm in Sweden, conceptualized this idea of planetary boundaries, and that is the idea that the Earth system was stable enough, and it has been stable for in terms of acting as a life-supporting system. It has been reasonably stable in the last 70 million years, so it's a stable system, but you don't have to push it, you shouldn't push it too far. And so the planetary boundaries is the idea that there are limits in terms of biogeochemical cycles that you cannot cross. And if you cross those limits, or boundaries rather, if you cross those boundaries, then the system starts not being able to come back to a satisfactory equilibrium. It will come back to an equilibrium. Planet Earth is not threatened in itself, but its capacity of behaving as a life-supporting system, and ideally as a life-supporting system for humans, needs to take into consideration these limits. You can't read them, and I can't read them either, but they involve the state of the qualitative and quantitative of water resource, the flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, climate change, obviously, the quantity of ozone in the atmosphere, etc., etc. And the last entry, there were 8 boundaries until relatively recently, and the 9th boundary was added at some point, and probably this one. It's the boundary of the amount of pollutants in the environment, and you have heard of this ongoing debate on PFAS pollutants, what they call eternal pollutants. So the idea that some groups of chemical pollutants are spreading in the environment up until the top of the Everest, and they will never disappear because they are very strong molecules, and they not disaggregate, or and so that's why they are called eternal pollutants, and you find them everywhere. Plastics, you find plastics and microplastics everywhere. So that's the kind of things that are studied here, and I showed you this worrying timeline, which shows that more and more of the planetary boundaries are crossed. The only optimistic one is the ozone, the quantity of ozone in the higher atmosphere, because, well, you were not born, obviously, and I was. But in the 1970s, there was a strong international debate on the fact that there would be holes in the ozone layer in the higher atmosphere, and that would be dramatic because the sun would hit the planet much harder, and it would have all sorts of consequences. And at that time, there was a general mobilization, so to speak, international mobilization to prohibit the chemical substances that were responsible for this these holes in the ozone layer. And if you look at the graphs, it stopped the degradation of the atmosphere. From that respect, stopped, which is a message of hope. What then is the role of infrastructure, network infrastructures in these global environmental or metabolic changes? I think they play at least 3 complementary roles. The first one is that they have resulted in the massive extension of urban hinterlands. Until the 18th century, so to speak, as I said, cities were dependent on roads, paths, and rivers to get their supplies, and their hinterland, the space on which they have to rely to provide the resources needed for urban activities, were very, very small areas around the cities. With the development of transport, communications, but also energy infrastructures, obviously, this changed entirely, and I'll show you in the example of Paris in a few minutes. The second contribution is what I call the intensification of metabolization processes. So metabolization is the transformation of material resources for social purposes. And the development of infrastructure systems, especially energy, water, waste, do just that. They are designed and developed to metabolize, to go and fetch resources, energy resources, material resources far away, to bring them and transform them for urban uses, and then to reject pollution as far as possible in the environment where no one sees them, or people who don't matter, and so and infrastructures are really key in that process of intensification. And the third is, but of course it's all related, it's an invisibilization invisibilization, I did it, of material resources and metabolic flows. That is the idea that most infrastructures travel underground, especially these metabolic infrastructures. They get resources from far away, they reject pollutions and waste far away, and so in a way they invisibilize the whole flows of material resources that are involved in urban functioning. And this was criticized under the phrase planetary urbanization, and I added the cover of this book, Implosions, Explosions, edited by Neil Brenner in 10 years ago. And it seems very material, very environmental, and very ecological, and very metabolic in a way, because you see these are probably sand tar sites in Alberta in Canada. That is the exploitation of fossil fuels that are dispersed in tar sands in Canada. And if you go until page 4 and 455, you have the human footprint around the Mediterranean. So you see the Sahara Desert, of course, is less concerned, except for the roads that cross it. But the rest of the Mediterranean basin has a very strong human footprint. And this is what led Brenner and his colleagues to describe situations in terms of planetary urbanization. That is, nothing on the planet is not urban directly or affected by the functioning of urban areas indirectly. But in fact, in the book, it's just to say, in the book, this material perspective is not developed that much. It remains a little metaphorical. So a quick example now to illustrate that. Here we have food, energy, and water flows in the Paris region over 2 centuries, so in 1786, 1896, and 2006. And it's very interesting to look at and to describe. If you look at the left-hand chart, it's a consumption of a variety of resources per capita, that is per inhabitant. It's not global, it's per inhabitant. And you see that between 1786 and 1896, the consumption of water has been multiplied by at least, well, let's say 10 or 15 before the beginning of the 20th century. And if you look the next chart, you see that it even diminished between 1896 and 2006. But my point at this stage is to say that this 10 or 15-fold increase that you can see on the two left-hand charts is entirely infrastructural. That is, it can be related very clearly to the building of canals from the northeast of Paris to supply Paris with abundant water, which was needed, or was considered as needed, it was needed for all sorts of uses in particular, and we do that in Paris still today. I don't know, I know that in Barcelona you have a water problem, a serious water issue now, but so it's probably not the case. But in Paris we wash the street clean. That is, we use water from this original 19th century network to clean the water with, to clean the streets with water. So this explosion of the water consumption is really an effect of infrastructural development. And if you look at the two right-hand charts, you can see that the brown entity, which is primary energy consumption, has been relatively stable until the end of the 19th century, but then exploded, and again the increase is probably sixfold. It exploded between 1896 and 2006, and this is, of course, the development of directly the result of the development of global infrastructures for the exploitation of fossil fuels, which are not so much available, at least in Europe. There are some, or there have been some resources, some fossil fuel resources in Europe. There are a lot in North America, but most of it comes from the Middle East, and as we all know, from Russia and also from Maghreb. But so this explosion in energy consumption is a direct result of the development of energy infrastructures, and not the other way around, to a large extent. Another illustration is feed and food provision for Paris. And here you have only two charts, 1896 and 2016. And in 1896, you can see that all of the feed and food, feed is for animals, food is for humans, so feed and food provision of Paris was national. And in France, it was largely in the closer part of France. And in the right-hand chart, it's completely different, because you have a part of food provision which comes from Spain in the form of tomatoes and strawberries and other vegetables, which are very much distributed in French stores. But for feed supply, that is the feed for animals, comes largely from South America, and again this was not possible when there were no extensive transport infrastructures, in that case boat transport infrastructures, covering the entire planet, to bring huge quantities of soya, because that's what it is, from South America to feed the French beef, and not only beef, but also, I guess, chicken, and also all sorts of animals, but primarily beef. So just to point the spatial extension of the huge increase in the quantity of the resources consumed, and the spatial extension of where you go and get the resources, all this due to infrastructural development. This is not this chart I wanted to show you, but it's the only one I found. So this one is material stock contained in buildings and so housing and tertiary buildings in the Paris regions, and you can see that between 1913 and 2013, over a century, it was multiplied between 3 and 4. It's all confusing now. Anyway, the quantity of materials in collective housing has been multiplied by 4, in individual housing by 3, and in service buildings by 4, when the population was multiplied in the same area, but more or less 2. So the intensification of processes is clear. I'm coming close to my conclusion. I hope you're not too bored or tired or confused or all of them at the same time. But there is today a growing critique of infrastructures in at least 4 different directions. The first is a critique of extractivism, that is the idea that infrastructures help go and take resources from other parts of the world, and to the detriment generally of the local populations. And so this raises major issues, and you may have heard of debates where we have a French company, Total Energy, which has an extensive network of infrastructures in all the global south to extract fossil fuels in conditions that are not always ideal. And so this is an example of extractivism, and so extractivism is more and more criticized, at least by social scientists. It's not so much criticized by public authorities. but it's also criticized nationally. For example, in France, there is a mine there is a project to develop a mine to extract lithium, which is used in electric batteries, and people are happy with the batteries for their phones and soon enough for their cars, but they are not very happy with the idea of a mine in the middle of France. A second critique is techno-solutionism. That is the idea that, and it's related, but it's the other side of the network ideology I mentioned before. It's related to the idea that, in the end, infrastructures help solve the problems that infrastructures have created. And so at some point, maybe it's worth thinking of, should we not try and find an alternative path in which infrastructures will not create so many problems. I'll take an example. A third criticism has to do with what Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist, has called the acceleration, and he finds late modernity, that is the last 50 years, as a period of very strong acceleration in social rhythms and the alienation that goes with it. And again, infrastructures were instrumental in that. And the fourth is financialization, that is the idea that material resources are moved not so much to respond to essential needs, but primarily to make profits. To make profits today based on promises of future revenue in particular. But I don't have time to discuss that in detail. Of course, there are other critiques. Not all critiques are metabolic, but the combination, at least, of these four lines of critique has powerful effects. Nevertheless, the modernist project, that is the idea that you can have better futures through technological and, in that case, infrastructural development, is still very powerful. And if you read the press, you can see that the future has to be smart, low carbon, resource efficient, even resilient. I know that Francesc is very much into resilience, but when you hear the word resilience spoken by the leaders of large industrial firms, they don't have the same notion of resilience exactly. They know how to achieve resilience, but it's not the way you would think spontaneously. So all these dominant futures, that is, the futures that are promoted by public authorities, state authorities, large firms, powerful actors, all these futures are very infrastructural. And people understand that. They understand that infrastructural development, under some forms, not all infrastructural developments, but under some forms, is problematic because it locks you into a specific kind of future. And in France, and I don't know in Spain, but I would suppose in the same, in France there are very strong conflicts around infrastructure projects. Around new airports, for example, are very strongly opposed. New highways, especially tollways, water storage facilities, there have been near civil war, it's exaggerated, but very strong conflicts where the government has sent the army to protect empty water basins from ecological activists who wanted to contest this old notion that in order to fight droughts, that is periods of time without water, you should need to build huge basins and fill them during the whole winter with the water contained in the water tables, so that when summer comes and you have the drought, you have no water, you can use the water in the basin. And more people challenge this kind of technological solutions to problems, which are not solutions because, as you well know, in Catalonia, if you have a 1-year drought, that's one thing. But if you have a 4-year drought, your basin is empty at the end of the first year. What do you do the next year? So you have really to start thinking differently. And so there are conflicts because people understand that's where social futures are constructed. What alternative infrastructural futures can we think of then? keeping in mind the distinction between infrastructures that are already there and infrastructures that could be developed in the future, that are developed today and that could be developed in the future, arguably to solve the problems that in fact they might accentuate in the end. And also keep in mind that infrastructures have been repurposed in the past 200 years in significant ways. I did not mention that too much, but I could not speak of everything. And they could be also, they could also be repurposed in the future. I have to close at some point. So I won't detail that because it would take some more time, but I think the key idea is that infrastructures cannot be changed independently from other major social, political, economic change. And where I am now in my reflection on these issues, I think that four dimensions are worth reflecting upon. Dematerialization, which is not digitalization, because digital infrastructure is very, very material. It involves a lot of material, especially a lot of energy to function. It's different, or it's going much beyond increased technical efficiency, but it's more reflecting in terms of sufficiency, that is, attending to essential needs of everybody before attending to other more or less essential demands, with this perspective of dematerialization. Slowing down, that is in response to the acceleration diagnosed by Rosa. Definancialization, that is decoupling the flows of material resources from financial revenues, because if the key indicator is how much money you can make by moving resources, material resources around, then you keep moving materials because the money is the key. So if you want to demonetize, so to speak, material flows, then it's a whole endeavor in itself. And autonomization, that is the idea of organizing the provision of essential services at various local scales, relying much more on local resources rather than on the import of resources taken from other territories. And there is a connection between this metabolic autonomy, so to speak, and a more political autonomy, that is the idea of deciding your own rules as a local community, so to speak, deciding your own rules and complying to them, which I don't have time to develop. And this is, of course, a question I was asked to respond. What civil engineers for the next 50 years? So I thought this could be the last slide, because obviously the answer to this question is what many of you, see if you are from this school, will be responsible for answering, and obviously not me, especially now that pension age is getting older and older. The next 50 years is probably the good timeline for all of you. But I still risked a few elements. So what civil engineers? Is it engineers that will be developing new infrastructures to satisfy ever-growing needs in the next 50 years? There's a question mark. I think not. I personally think not. I think it would be a wrong perspective. I think there are many other interesting things to do, though. The first is taking care of at least some of the existing infrastructure, some or many of the existing infrastructures, and whether they are water supply network, sanitation network, transportation network. There's a lot to do just to maintain in good shape, and possibly to repurpose, as I mentioned earlier, existing infrastructure, rather than responding in terms of, oh, it's nothing, we'll just add another infrastructural layer and it will solve all problems. Second point, thinking about things living, that is, which I don't know here, but now I have an idea. If you have never heard of planetary boundaries and that kind of stuff, in my school, at least, courses about the living environment, soils, ecosystems, biodiversity is very scarce, is very little developed. And I think in the coming years and decades, civil engineers will have to have a profound understanding of, well, as profound as science allows, because we do not understand so much about ecosystems even now, but as much as possible about living environments, not just neutral, dead, or environments. I take one example, which is very much debated today. Should we go, we leave Elon Musk on Mars, which is another expansion of the hinterland, of the Earth hinterland, but should we go and exploit resources that are in the bottom of the seas? My answer is probably for the next 200 years, no, and then we'll see. But it's clear, if you are scientists, so little is known about how this whole thing is functioning, what's going on at the bottom of the oceans, that if you go and dig because there are things interesting and because technology allows it, you go and history shows towards really problematic situations. And my third and last, this one is really the last words I'll say, is I would encourage you, as any other engineers, to act within society rather than for society. There is a century-old tendency of engineers to see themselves as a group of people who know better, and so they design solutions, and then the question is, how will populations accept these solutions? And it doesn't work anymore. It worked to a large extent for a long time, but it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore because people are more and more skeptical about the promises of techno-scientific development in which engineers are involved, and also because and they are less and less, more and more skeptical because the consequences of the previous generations of technological developments are obvious to all, and also because in a way, I could say we, I mean, as a group, because I'm also an engineer, even if that was a long time ago, but as a group, and it applies also to public authorities, we tend to be conservative in the way of framing problems. That is, if you construct problems with the populations concerned, it will open up to solutions, options that you would not have thought of alone. I think it's a quite general rule, and we had I would say a life experiment or a real life experiment in France recently with a conference on climate change, a citizen conference on climate change, in which more than 100 citizens were picked at random to represent the whole of France, and they were asked to make. They were informed of scientific and technological debates and social debates on energy transitions and climate change, and then they were asked to make propositions, and the propositions they made were much bolder than, they were not all revolutionary, but some of them were much bolder, much more disruptive than the propositions made by the experts. It does not apply, so again, it does not apply only to engineers, but engineers have a special responsibility in that, but it applies to public authorities, and it also applies to well-intentioned ecological groups. There's a group in France called Negawatt, which is for the non-consumption of energy, and they act exactly the same. They have this, build this scenario among experts, and they say, now we have to deliver this scenario because it's the only one which works. And if you do like that, it won't work. Okay, I'll stop here. I was already too long, I think. Thank you. and for your patience.
See, one topic for me, it's at the center of the discussion here, is the question of water. Can you explain what is the approach in France, the problem of the restrictions of water, and with the topics that you propose at the last slide, or what is your approach? Can you take what is the problem that you have found with the experience of water with your approach?
Yeah, I'm not a real expert. There was a word that was fashionable for a small number of years, which was called dewatering, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. 15 years ago. It was also when the word nexus was fashionable. So the nexus between water, energy, and food, and so trying to find the most efficient combinations of water use, food production, and energy use, and so this idea of dewatering was the water version of dematerialization, and I think it has plenty of powerful implications. Because, for example, the discussion in France and maybe also in Spain, I don't know, for urban waters is the idea that you have to fight and to reduce leaks in the networks. And it's true that some water networks lose more than half of the water that is produced, potable water that is produced, before it reaches the tap. So there is a leak issue. But if you consider, from a metabolic perspective, the quantity of water that is consumed by any resident of Barcelona, except for that guy with this swimming pool which consumed obscene amounts of water, but otherwise, most of this water is consumed indirectly. That is, it is consumed as part of the water, as part of the food that the people consume, and the water that was needed to produce that food. So the water needed to produce tomatoes and strawberries, it's clear enough, and the implications it has in southern Spain is dramatic. But the water needed to grow beef, to then produce the meat that we consume, or some of us consume at least, the amount of water is very large. And so if you compare the water used through the tap, even with 1 shower a day, and the water used indirectly through the food and the other goods that you consume, because obviously water, and the energy, because water, there's a lot of water which is used in energy production, then you see there are many important directions for dewatering, for reducing the use of water. In France, there is a water strategy that has been defined by the government recently, and because the situation with peasants, I don't know the modern word for peasants, anyway, people who grow food, and because the situation is so tense, they have decided that water for agricultural use would not be in the strategy. And it makes no sense, because water for agricultural use is much more important than water for direct urban use, and it's less important than water use for energy production. But then again, what do you mean by use? Because water, the quantity, the overall quantity of water available on the planet is stable. I mean, in one form or another, water does not disappear. it goes in the air, it falls down at some point. The air is more or less humid, and there is more or less water in the seas and in the ice of the Arctic. But overall, the quantity of water on the planet is nearly stable. The thing is that the location and the quality of water is very much of a problem too.
Any question? Yeah?
I'm just curious about how to deal with the difficulties that we face when we have these ideas that may be so unpopular to the general public, and we know that we have to take like very difficult decisions and very difficult changes, but probably places that are more like in the world that are more educated may have stronger communities of in a sense of empowerment, but also there are other communities that are facing the biggest issues, no, like in the South Global in general, and may not have may have less tools of even within them to face maybe big companies or big armies even. So yeah, these challenges of having good intentions but unpopular solutions.
No, but yes, it's simpler from my position to say you should do this, you should not do that. But first of all, engineers do not decide really. They decisions in democratic states, decisions are supposedly made by elected officials, and it's true that elected officials, when making their decisions, take all sorts of advice, and engineers have a very specific advice, which is advice on the best techno-scientific solutions that are adapted to the situation at stake. The thing about the best solution is that the best solution is not the same best for everybody. And so my point was to be at least discuss all best solutions, or discuss all solutions with all stakeholders, including the population concerned, and it will broaden the range of solutions that engineers with their own intellectual tools will then try to make sense of and address, and so it may really improve, by doing nothing else, it improve the solutions that are, the engineering solutions that are suggested. Then of course there is this idea that even if there is a, let's try a new word, a best techno-ecological solution for a problem, that it may not be the best financial solution, and financial interests are very powerful, and so maybe in the end the solution that is most rewarding financially will be chosen, and the best technical or techno-ecological solution will be forgotten, and this is a story of our society. This is how things happen. So if one may only hope that if too many bad solutions are chosen just because they make profits for a few determined actors, they at some point they will be resisted, and it's not really clear how to decouple the material problems from their financial counterparts. Is one of the things I was mentioning at the end of my talk. It's if you think of that in terms of ultimate consequences, what it means is probably even revolutionary. But there are considerable margins of progress to make to say, okay, there's a money issue, it's an issue, but let's think of other issues as well, which may be even more important, more pressing.
Have any question? I would like to propose another question, because you have been working about mobility, the dependence of
long time ago.
Long time ago. What is your approach in a conception of network for the 20th century with a crisis, energetic crisis, renewable energies, with electric cars, and these broad possibilities, no? These possibilities of solutions. What is your experience in with this approach that you propose here?
Hour of tricky questions.
But only some.
Yeah. No, we've seen things that do not seem to work well. In France, we have tried what we call the carbon tax, and the carbon tax generated riots, more or less, in France. Not because people, in my understanding, not because people don't care about the end of the world, they do, but because they felt it was really, really unfair that this tax would disproportionately affect people on low income, living in very rural parts of the territory, who absolutely need their car to move around, to function, and while at the same time there were no taxes planned on kerosene, for example, which all sorts of people use, but which is disproportionately used by upper class and rich people, and so the key to resistance was really an idea of fiscal justice, or fiscal injustice in that case. So that didn't work. French governments tried twice, and it didn't work. And I think in both cases it was because it was felt, and it was indeed quite unfair. Another approach now is not for climate change, but for health issues and air pollution in cities, is to limitate or restrain car traffic in city centers. So what we call zones à faible émission, low emission zones, and again the government has tried and then has stepped back, because there is strong local resistance in all cities for this, and again on an argument of social justice, because the idea was that you would be allowed to drive your car in the central part of the city if you had a car that is not polluting, that is an electrical car or a hybrid car, which are the worst of all cars, hybrid cars, but in ecological terms, or a high performance, even combustion car. But who has these highly performant cars and expensive cars? It's the richer part of the population, and again it results in stopping the poorer part of the population from accessing city centers when others can do it. A simpler approach would, and probably socially more just approach, would be to just prohibit the circulation of cars. It's not whether you have a highly performant car or not. It's just nobody is allowed, nobody, except exceptions, is allowed to circulate in the city center. And my guess, but I may be wrong because I'm not an expert, my guess is that it would be accepted much more freely. There's another example, or is it in this idea of social justice. When the European Commission and Parliament adopted this directive on the electrification of the park, of the automobile park, and by 2035, no combustion cars will be sold. New combustion cars will be sold in Europe. Arguably, let's see what happens. And there were exceptions to this rule that for combustion cars, for petrol-fueled or gas-fueled cars, it was called the Ferrari exception, and it was a good trick from the Germans, I must say, because it should have been a Mercedes or a Porsche exception, but it was termed the Ferrari exception, and it was the idea that for some very specific cars that are produced maybe by dozens a year or hundreds, they contribute so little to general pollution that you can still allow their construction because it's so important for I don't know what. But the Ferraris, the Lamborghinis, the Porsche, the really high up one, they should be allowed to be produced further. So it's an exception maybe for 5 years or 10 years, I don't know. But the symbol, in terms of social justice, I think is really dramatic. So it's non-responses really, but I think justice, social justice is a key in those transformations.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I believe it's a very inspiring presentation for all of us, also for our young audience today. My question would be about the concept of the 15-minute city. So trying to talk about a little bit of urban planning too. The thing is that you have spoken of hidden environmental costs, for instance, or the idea of providing essential services, etc., in relation to infrastructure. But when we talk about the 15-minute city, for instance, we always focus on providing services. But we don't talk about the hinterlands or where food's coming from, resources, and so on. So apparently, there's something missing within the whole concept. And I'd like you on this to offer your opinion on this whole idea of the 15-minute city. Thank you.
I suppose the 15-minute city comes in very various, variegated forms. So, and probably some are more metabolically efficient, maybe than others. I think the idea of the general idea, but again, I'm not an expert of these issues. But the general idea to say let's rethink differently in the way on access to essential daily life resources and services, and allow the population to function on more local resources. I think in principle it's very interesting and probably promising because it visibilizes in a way part of a hidden costs of urban living today, which are the cost of transportation. I don't know in Spain, but in France it's very clear. People on relatively low income, because they want to buy their home and because they are incited to buy their homes by public authorities, and because in many urban areas the cost of land is very high, and so having a home, if you want to be able to pay for it, you have to go relatively far from city centers, and they do that, and so they are able to buy a home which is within their budgets, but at the same time they have to face very significant transportation costs. For example, if two adults in the households are active, they have to have 2 cars because, and so they spend a lot of petrol to travel. So I think, and this is, and people realize that, but afterwards, that is, once they realize that there is a pressure on their budget that they had not anticipated, and so in a way, this thinking of being able to rely on more local resources, it is interesting in this respect because it makes you think differently. On the other hand, it's probably very difficult to achieve. There were a lot of reflections on getting people nearer from their workplace, for example, until the point that you realize that in a household there may be several people who work, and the workplace not at the same location. And so what does bringing people nearer to their workplace mean in that sense? So there are strong limitations for for that. And then final point, because I didn't mention it and I wanted to mention it. But it depends on also what kind of living style you have in this 15-minute city, and obviously if as we do, I can say we because I'm part of the picture here, as we do in central Paris, we have a 15-minute, well I don't, but many people first they go to work because they have this highly skilled intellectual professions. Either they work from home or they go to a workplace once a week, and when they go, it's next door, or they bike to it. So we have a 15-minute city for a large part of the Paris population during the week, and then during the weekend they go to their second home in Normandy. They go for a little weekend in Barcelona because it's cool, and so the balance is if you look at the entire picture, then it's a bit different. There would be a lot of other things to say, but.
Okay, if there is no more questions, I think we can finish. It's 2 o'clock, and thank you very much, Olivier. I hope that you are interested on things.
It's probably full of things that are approximate, but if it helps, I can also circulate the PowerPoint, the slides, if someone's interested. Like, okay. But you have them, or I can give it to. Well, it's on the computer here, and so if anyone's interested.
Okay, I am going to put on the Atenea.
Thank you.